Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to all of you who took some time out of your day to listen to the latest and greatest on the statewide Parcel program. I'm Bob, the Parcel program manager for the state, and I'm here with Michelle. She is the project manager for AppGeo, who is assisting us with this statewide Parcel program. And so together, we just kind of wanted to give you an update on where we are with things. Just before I forget, if you've got a question, feel free to post it in the chat. Michelle and I will try to periodically review that. And as we can, maybe answer as we go. But if not, we've got some time near the end where we can cover some of that. So anyway, so Michelle's going to be running the slide deck. She's got the recording on, and so here we go. Michelle, if you want to go, there you are, one step ahead of me as usual. So anyway, the agenda is fairly robust. It covers a lot of territory, but I think a lot of this will be probably review for some of you, but I know there's also going to be some new information for some of you. And I also know there's some information that's new for everybody. So it's just a real buffet of choices here. So we just want to get everybody on the same page. So anyway, we'll just get started here. I'll hand it off to Michelle, and she'll be touching a little bit on the importance of parcel data.
All right, thanks, Bob. So thanks everybody for coming. Like Bob said, some of this might be review for some of you who have been to our past informational sessions, but I definitely think it's worth reviewing again. I want to take a minute to remind us all of why the state parcel program is very important and why parcel data should even be made available like this. And based on my experience working with parcel data for nearly 16 years, there's just so many use cases and benefits for this type of information. This list on the screen is just some of the use cases and benefits of parcel data. It's not exhaustive by any means, and it does apply to many or even all of the states, not just North Dakota. On the left, you'll see there's some state agency use cases, and then of course, North Dakota is included in many of these, such as reducing or eliminating duplication of effort, assisting in site planning, supporting enrollment of lands into state programs, updating administrative boundaries, for example, city boundaries. Also, state police can use data in their CAD systems to assess property boundaries and ownership for 911 calls. And also, as I just learned the other day, NextGen 911 for the state is using the statewide parcel data set already as well. It can be used for natural disaster planning and response. It also expedites federal aid for disasters by having current data on hand in case of an emergency. So those are some state agency use cases. Again, just a short list of the many that there are out there. There's a lot of county use cases too, and those are on the right. Some of those include making it easier for developers, supporting emergency response, especially in mutual aid situations, improving the public's experience, and making it easier to access data. And easier access to data also means reduced data requests for the counties as well. And then, of course, there's always unintended consequences of anything we do, and parcel data program is not not immune from that. But one of the unintended consequences is improvements of the data, and that's due to a couple of things. One is that the state, through this program, provides information back to the counties about the quality of the data that was submitted. And so the counties can use that information to help improve their data, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. A second is that as the data gets used more and more in new and different ways by being openly available in this way, there are just more and more eyes on it, and therefore more opportunities to identify and resolve any quality issues. So for example, case in point is the Department of Game and Fish uses this parcel data in their land posting application, and landowners are always providing them feedback, which we hear about, and then we pass along those that feedback to the counties. So these are just a few use cases and benefits to highlight, and like I said, there are many, many more.
All right, my turn. Thanks, Michelle. The 4 bullets across the top there reflect some information that we have from other states and from North Dakota. And I think it's fair to say that North Dakota, like all states, there's a lot of competition goes on for economic development, resources, innovative projects, and jobs. And this morning, I was able to kind of listen in on the North Dakota governor's executive recommendation for the budget, and he touched on all those things. So we're front and center on this sort of thing. He talked about how extremely competitive things are now with costs the way they are and the labor force and so forth. So parcels play a big role on addressing some of those. Here in our state, we are very fortunate where the counties are making their data available. And the question might be, why do we keep it available? Why do we keep it open? And I think there's some general expectations. If you get past the economic development and so forth, people these days just expect the information to be available, readily available online, to be transparent, that sort of thing. And then there on the left too, that second bullet is having that data standardized is very beneficial for analyses, not even just trying to know who to contact because you're going across multiple counties for a transmission line or something, but just to be able to run analyses to do different sort of programming type of work. And then I stole this from Michelle, or actually she contributed the information there on the right, but recently there was a New York State GIS Association webinar highlighting some of the benefits of using their data. And they were going through some of the data, trying to figure out, who some of the users are and how they might best be using it. And I'm sure I'm butchering this based on how Michelle originally portrayed this, but it just dovetails into what Michelle's talking about and what the governor's saying is about how do we make sure all of our communities have an equal footing for consideration of any kind of site selection for new businesses and so forth. It's just uber critical now. And I think in the case of New York, they had an example of one of those businesses turned out to be Amazon, and Amazon ended up building a warehouse, so right away you've got more jobs, more tax base, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, we're in the broadband scenario once again, and that's very important too, to get wall-to-wall broadband coverage, especially to the rural areas. Parcels play a big role on that. Anyway, so moving on down into the blobs of, I guess, from the different entities across the state, we get input from various folks, and you can read, I won't read all of these, but what these all point to is time saving, to come across it really fast. I think there's one person on the call today that he had expressed to me that if we don't have this data available, it takes work to get to it. In his business, he's seen his clients has completely walked past that state or completely walked past that county. It's like they don't have time to process it on a first pass, maybe in a secondary pass. So that's a big thing. So these quotes that we see here, there's time and time involved on that. So anyway, enough of that. Michelle's going to pull back the curtain a little bit. We think it's important so that people can see what's going on behind the scenes. So Michelle, go ahead.
All right. So the first thing I want to tell you about, a little bit of news I'd like to share about what we're working on, is the Parcels data standard. So we're slowly working on a new version. We're starting with the existing 2007 Parcel data standard that had an agricultural focus. And the goal is to ultimately align the state's parcel data standard to the state's parcel program. In particular, the data schema that's being used for the state's parcel program. But So part of this work is going to involve, or has involved already actually, researching and considering parcel data standards from other states. My company, AppGeo, we work in a lot of states, and we've been working with parcel data for a really long time. So we are familiar with what other states are doing and their standards. And we're also looking at other state standards as well to get input onto what should be included that might not be in the North Dakota standard. The existing guidance on the agricultural land is going to stay in the new standard. That's not going anywhere. But we're going to also extend it with additional guidance that could help with preparing standardized data for the state parcel data program, such as linking to tax roll from parcels, GIS parcels. While we're currently in the mode of reviewing and researching and making suggestions. So if you have any thoughts already, like off the top of your head, on things that you'd like to see get addressed in the new standard, please definitely reach out to us. And as we make progress on this, we'll keep you all updated. And so stay tuned for that. And before we, finish it and publish it, of course, there'll be a chance for people to review the draft. Next is something we are working on, and it's for reducing the number of mismatches that we are reporting. So some of you might be like, what are mismatches? And so just for a little refresher, mismatches, they're basically identified by joining the tax roll records to the GIS parcel records by their ID. And we find the records that don't join up. And then we reverse it in the opposite direction, and we join the GIS parcels to the tax roll records. And that process is automated. It runs every time any new data, any new GIS parcels or tax roll records are submitted to the state program. And then it runs and it produces a new mismatch report. And then that mismatch report is loaded to the program's website. That's, for instance, that's shown on the slide here. That's from the June webinar. So that slide might look a little familiar. But that's where we're showing how if you were to go to that page, when you go to the county parcel data enhancements page and you choose your county or a county that you're interested in, you can get a zip file that contains the mismatch report. And that report will contain two tabs for mismatches. It's going to have a tab for GIS parcel records that have no tax roll match, and then another tab for tax roll records that have no GIS parcel match. And if there is a tab, one of those tabs is missing from the report, it means that there were no mismatches of that type. So that's pretty awesome. That's the goal. It'd be awesome if every county had no tabs in their mismatch report, but it's very common to have mismatches. But the goal is to make that number of mismatches as small as possible to have really clean data. And there are a few counties that have a really good mismatch rate. So earlier this year, we were going around talking to the different counties to provide guidance about how they can use these reports and explain how they can use them to improve their data. And several people gave us some feedback that, well, there's just too many inactive parcels in these reports, and they obscure the real mismatches. And that makes it hard for us to review and focus on the true mismatches. So then we had to figure out, well, what do they mean by inactive parcels? that was new to us to think about. So then we embarked on this journey to figure out what these inactive parcels were and how do we reduce the number of mismatches being reported, i.e. how do we reduce the inactive parcels from the mismatch reports, and should we? So we've been kind of working through that. First, we started by assessing what are the major types of mismatches across the counties, and it was determined that there are 4 main types of inactive parcel mismatches, and that those are the ones that seem to be bogging down the mismatch reports. So that includes centrally assessed records. Centrally assessed records are for tax purposes only, and they don't have a specific location or specific parcel associated. Therefore, they'll only ever appear in the tax roll. They're not going to be in GIS data. So they'll always create a mismatch if they're included in the tax roll data that's supplied to us. Then we have exempt parcels. Those are lands such as government-owned land that's not taxed. And then there are city and township records, and these seem to always be in the tax roll data provided, but it's a mixed bag in the GIS data. Some counties have individual city parcels digitized, and some have a placeholder polygon or placeholder polygons for an entire city, and some have a mix of both, and some have none. There might just be a gap in the map. And then there are these other inactive records, and these are less common, but they tend to be more like the type of parcels that are like working records. So they're not quite finished or ready for prime time, but they still somehow end up being provided in the data. Those last three types, the exempt, the city, and the other inactive, those could be in both the tax roll and GIS data, depending on how the county manages their data and their export processes for supplying the data to the state. So there's lots of combinations of things, and we just needed more info. So we then launched a survey to learn from each county about how they or their vendors handle each of these types of records and the data that they provide to us. So some of you are familiar with that and responded to the survey, and thank you very much to those who did. We didn't get responses for all of the counties. So for now, we're going to just work with what we do have from those who did respond. And we might be calling on some of those people to prod a little further about your survey responses where we need a little clarification. So if you hear from us on that, don't be surprised. So we did that, that's complete. And so now we're reviewing the responses from the survey, and we're looking at the data and for each county, and we're determining if the data needs to be filtered in some way. Do we filter it either prior to it being supplied to us, like before it gets to us, so the county or the vendor would filter it, like for example, with centrally assessed records? Or do we need to filter it just so that these records aren't included in the mismatch report, but we still want them in the data? So we're thinking through each one and making sure that if we're going to request or apply a filter, that it won't actually end up creating new mismatches by doing so. So for example, if the county has exempt parcels in both their GIS data and their tax roll, but they have a bunch of mismatches in either tab of their report, well, those are actually true mismatches, and they should be resolved, because if you're going to track exempt records in GIS and in tax roll, then they should be joining up by some common ID. So we're not going to apply a filter on exempt records in that scenario where they're on both sides. That way they'll continue to be reported as mismatches until they're resolved in the county's data. We have decided, though, that centrally assessed records could be completely filtered from the data before we even get it. So before it's imported into the statewide data set, because they're always going to be mismatched. And finally, we'll either have to request that data providers update their export process to pre-filter it before submitting it to us, so those centrally assessed parcels, or if it's appropriate and technically possible, then we can filter the data that we have instead of it being filtered beforehand. So we're pretty close on the centrally assessed types so far. So we know Tyler Technology, they've already pre-filtered the records, the centrally assessed records from the data before it gets to us. And GovernSoft, they created a standardized export for the program recently, and they supplied us with fields that we would need in order to apply any filters. So we are working on that. And CPT is currently working on updating their standard export that is used for the program to pre-filter the centrally assessed records as well. And we're in the process of scheduling a discussion with Software Innovations to figure out how to handle these in the counties that they support as well. So we're pretty close there on centrally assessed. Then we need to filter the data, if possible, for any inactive parcels that are in the GIS data that should be filtered from being included in the mismatch reports. So we'll evaluate and apply those filters if necessary. Over to you, Bob.
All righty. Well, thanks, Michelle. That was a ton of information, but it's, I think, very good in-depth information. So just as a reminder, we are recording this and we'll make this the link and presentation available on the GIS or on the let me start over on the Parcel program website. So once that's out there, we'll let you know. So anyway, I just want to look a little bit at some of the statistics of the usage. This was like a 3-month look back, and this is just the raw services, the web services that are being used. And it's definitely showing a very strong tendency to use the web-based services, and that's either like in a viewer or someone's application on the desktop, any number of things. But it's interesting to know that we're getting over 14,000 basically requests per day, and that's even assuming people are taking time off over the weekend. So that number would go up if we just did that during the business days. So it's definitely getting hit hard. In terms of data downloads, there's different ways of looking at that. Some of the tools aren't as robust as this one, but from what I can glean, we've got about, over the same time period, about 262 data downloads. And so even though that's not insignificant, just seeing the number of hits, is quite amazing. And I think it also reflects that it's like other data sets on the GIS Hub, it's a large data set. So, there are certainly times to need to download it, but if you can stream it, it typically is a whole lot easier to go that route. And I'd like to think that by having these web services in the data download, that should be meeting one of our original goals set forth, that we're pulling away some of the data requests from the counties. Again, the counties are the authoritative data source, right? But hopefully this would still help them out a little bit. So anyway, on the next slide there, Michelle, please. There we go. Thanks. So we've learned a lot from the early days of this, when this program was still just a project. But these days it boils down to really 4 different types of data input. And so I just want to make a note that move it, term or name, and FME, those are basically software applications that the state is using. And so we're leveraging that. That helps us saves us a lot of cost, actually. But the way we have it architected, and this is one of the big roles that AppGeo has been playing, is that we're able to work with different file formats and so forth, different data sources. So I just want to point out there's like 4 different data streams, basically. The top one, whether it's the county or their vendor, they manually upload the data, like maybe it's the Excel file for the tax roll. They move it, they upload it into Move It, and then the state parcel program takes over from there. Another popular approach is where the vendor has something automated and then scheduled, where instead of a manual upload, one of their systems uploads the data on their behalf. That works really well. We've got some vendors doing that. Another approach doesn't get hit as quite as much, but where the Move It tool can actually reach out and harvest data from the data source, like maybe a zip file or something like that. And then finally, FME, it does the same kind of thing. It can go out, reach out and do a harvest, but typically we're harvesting from ArcGIS online data sources or similar. And it's crazy on the explosion of the ArcGIS online open data sources. And it's a great approach because it's for those of you who are at the Geospatial Summit, I think I mentioned that it's a great way to for people to, at a very low cost point, to get their data out there. They still have full control of it, but it helps them out time-wise and whatnot, and it really helps us out just to be able to reach out and grab it. So anyway, on the upper right of this slide, it's just kind of a little representative sample of the different types. It just shows parcel data submission method, that one greenish column there. You can see there's references to FME and Move It and manual. On that same image, there's some frequency things like yearly, monthly, and so forth. I'll touch base on that here in a few slides. So, okay, next one, please, Michelle. Okay, just a few reminders. I know we've touched on some of this information before, but I think it never hurts just to remind folks in case they haven't seen it. So next slide. Yeah, so I think during the chat here, somebody was asking, Daryl was asking about standard. And I said, hey, go to this website, the one that we see here, and you scroll to the bottom and you'll see there on the right, basically the data set schema. And there's heaps of other information here. It's designed to cover a wide range of people who are interested, whether it's just like, what is this about? I'm a data provider. What's your schema? Hey, I hear there was a really good presentation by Michelle, not so much Bob, December 7th, but I'd like to hear that again. We'll have a link to that. So just want to point this out. This is a really important place on this. So, and if you have any questions on this, please let me know. Next slide, please. Okay, this will take a couple hours to go through. Not really. So the status map page, if you go to that Parcel program website and you scroll down, you'll see kind of a yellowish looking box like it shows there in the top center graphic to view status maps. Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I saw your little arrow there. But if you do that, it'll bring up a page and it will show these two images, the date imported of the tax roll and the date imported of the parcels. So I neglected to say when I use, or I think Michelle uses the term parcel, we typically are referring to the two data sets. I know Michelle's pointed out tax roll and the GIS boundaries. But here specifically, we're showing these things separate because they are separate in terms of how the data comes in. Typically, not always, but typically. So these maps have a lot of different uses, and it kind of depends on where you're coming from. So if you're county, or if you are a county or a data provider for a given county, and you're curious on how things are going, in terms of like, well, I know I updated that. It's automatic, or I did one last week. You can go here and see. It's just a note. If you look in the bottom lower center, it says maps are updated weekly. So if you just submitted something last night, the map's not going to reflect that. By all means, as many of you have, reach out and say, hey, I submitted it. Do you see the data? And I'll look and I'll say yes, and we'll go from there. And then there's also, if you're just a user, not just, but if you are a user of the data and you're curious on the vintage of the data, this would be very helpful. Like, hey, I'm going to go do something with an application. How old is McHenry for the tax roll? Hey, they're in good shape there, gray, that type of thing. So what it's doing is trying to depict when the data was last submitted, but it does not indicate when the data was last edited. So for any of those counties, if they, did a split or something, that's not reflecting the data that split as that example. It's simply the data that time that we've last imported it. So that's an important comment. So internally, we're using these maps, Michelle and I and her troops, to compare and look at our refresh frequency, our currency, trying to prioritize. And on that note, sometimes it will show us that we have something messed up. So we might say, I'll pick on Ward County there as an example. Not at all their fault, but under parcels, it's brown. It's our fault. We discovered, not that long ago that, things shift, things change, different ways of grabbing data and so forth, or submitting data. And I think there was something that fell through the cracks. It's on my shoulders for that. So that's being addressed as we speak. So it's a great visual to catch ourselves before we go down too far down the road. I do want to do a shout out. That upper box up there, please help us. The Parcel team, that's all of us, Michelle and her folks and my folks here, we're focusing on removing the brown we've kind of like saying by mid-January. We're doing that in anticipation of the Game and Fish updating or pushing out their February 1 deadline of their land posting app. So we're trying to get as much of this brown out of here as possible. I think you're going to see some big changes coming in the foreseeable future, because there's some things being worked on right now that will update these maps. But we just ask that if you see your county out there and you're like, what's up with that? We're brown, that's not good. Please reach out to us and we'll work it through. Go from there. So anyway, I think that's it on that. Anything else you can think of? Okay, anything else, Michelle?
No, I would say if you've got updated data and you want to submit it, please do. You don't have to wait until your like assigned upload frequency. Right. Although those are guidelines. If you want to, as long as you give us data, at the minimum of that frequency that's been defined, which I think we're going to touch on soon. We'll be happy, but we'd love to have data updated more frequently than that if possible. If you haven't updated data to the state in at least a year, like we definitely need it from you for this February 1 deadline for sure. So preferably sooner than later so that we can make sure it makes it through properly.
Yep. Thanks, Michelle. And if you're not sure, like when did I do it last or what format, that's where you can just reach out to Michelle or I, or go to the contact page and we'll help you out there. So anyway, next page, please. So here's the frequency, or AKA refresh schedule. So when we were first started out, we sent a survey out to all the counties, and I think the vendors, I think mostly just the counties, and said, hey, what makes sense for an update for your county? And so we used that information. For the counties we didn't hear back from, we made a kind of a guesstimate, somewhat educated guess, like based on population, for example. And so here's what we have on record right now for both the parcel boundary data and the tax roll data. So some folks are yearly, and of course monthly, and all the way to weekly. And we can change this. So if there's something that doesn't look right to you, it's like, oh my, we should really do that more often. Please let us know. We can definitely make that change. And so we just wanted to make this apparent for everybody that this is what we have on record right now. And I just had a note to myself here that as a reminder, this is the frequency of the data coming in. So the reality is when data comes in, it can come in, during the week. I should say over the course of a week, we could have 5 data sets. We could have 2, we could have 15 from all the different counties. It's not until at the end of the week, or really the start with Sunday, it compiles everything and pushes it out. So, there's all these little frequency things, but overall, this is actually describing the frequency at which we're expecting or running our processes to import data. This is what we have on record. And that's where if your county is brown or gray on the map, there's a connection between that on those status maps to this. So, okay, next slide, please. And I think that's yours, Michelle.
Sure is. So this is another helpful resource for the data providers. It's the data submission instructions document, and that is also available on the Parcel program website that we were just looking at before. And so it's just a one-pager handout, and it discusses that refresh schedule. It points you to the data submission requirements and the schema sheets, and it tells you how to access the statewide data. There's also guidance on there about where to go for more information. Some of the data submission requirements that the document points you to include remembering to provide consistent file formats. For example, if you provided tax roll in CSV format originally, you should continue to provide your tax roll export to us in CSV format and not change it up to an Excel file or to a text file tab delimited. It should be CSV, comma separated values. So that's one important point, is the consistent file formats. And another one is consistent database schemas. So meaning the same fields in your tables every time, the name of the field, the same list of fields, that should be consistent from submittal to submittal over time. But if you do have to change any of those things, that's fine, but it'd be great if we could get a heads up so we can work with you, because we'll need to update our processes in order to consume it so that when it's submitted, it doesn't just fail. But if it does fail, we get notified and we figure out what the problem is, and then we talk to you and find out what the change was, and then we make changes. But the ideal scenario is that consistent file formats and consistent fields or schemas is provided every time. Another key thing to note is ideally when you're submitting through a manual method of GIS parcel data, if you zip that or compress that, that's great. There are other requirements that are included in the submission requirements documentation on the website, but those are the core ones. And yeah, I think that's that.
All right. My favorite topic, redaction. It's a term we use. Redaction is a term that we use to kind of describe the process or the thinking that goes behind protecting of sensitive data. So during the last session, I just wrapped up the last one that we had. There was existing code that was updated. It was already there, but they updated it, and they clearly listed. I think they expanded actually on the list of individuals. And anyway, so it's also getting connected into the Parcel program. And I think everybody on the phone is aware of it, so I won't go into it. I just want to set that's the kind of the context. But what I want to point everyone's thinking to is, or awareness rather, is that how we treat the data. So most of the vendor software that we've seen have been told that most of the vendor software, like for the tax roll data, has some sort of I'll call it a flagging or redaction tool, where any record that has protected information, like a law enforcement officer, they can check that box or whatever it looks like on the software. And then when the data is exported, those fields that are sensitive, like maybe names or phone numbers or whatnot, maybe addresses, they're like blanked out or replaced with, gobbledygook characters or something. So that's usually what we're experiencing. So then what happens then in that second bullet is the county will typically let me know that, hey, yeah, use the tax roll data as you get it. And so it's been redacted, or there's no information that's been received, or someone's requesting that. So we can just use the data as received. So that's great. Now, if the county has not given me the permission to use the data as received because it's been redacted or they've checked and there's nobody on that list, or we just haven't been told, then we have to, I guess maybe, I don't know if due diligence is the right word, or going overboard is another term, but what we do is we remove all the names and addresses from the data for that county before that data set goes public. So on that particular last item, if we have to blank everything out, it reduces the value of that data. I think everybody understands there's certain individuals that can't be on there, but when there's somebody going back to the use cases, somebody's going through the data, they're needing to contact landowners or whatnot, that's going to be a challenge. And we do get some comments like, hey, something's wrong with your data, Bob. You know, it's not my data, but okay. You're missing all this. Like, then I have to explain what's going on. So I just want to make everybody aware of how the process works. So the data goes public, but we strip it if we have to. We prefer to, you know, have it, you know, redacted as needed. I did also want to make the point that, let's say, I'm just making this up. Let's say your county is scheduled for say a yearly update on the tax roll data, and you say, here it is, good to go, Bob. It's been redacted, use the data, knock your socks off. So we put it out there, and let's say 3 months into that year-long cycle, you get a request. There's a new judge or a new officer that submits that form. By all means, we can update our data to reflect that. We don't have to wait for that, you know, here comes a year and another whatever, 9 months or something. So, but typically in that case, you probably want to make sure you work with the vendor, because, you know, they'll have the tax roll data, and they might be one of those vendors that, oh, okay, yep, we'll run it tonight. You know, there's an automatic push. So, but if you have any questions on that, just let me know. And I did want to point out that the Parcel Viewer, and I think the Parcel program, Parcel Viewer, and many, if not all, county Parcel Viewers typically don't allow searching by name. So if there's, you know, Sheriff John Doe, they won't be able to find that person's name. So it's a due diligence thing. I think is kind of what it amounts to. So anyway, so the next slide, please. Okay, on this, I'm going to kind of run through the gamut of different methods of accessing the statewide parcel data set. So there's different ways, different users, different software. So that kind of reflects that. So the primary way of accessing the data is through our wonderful GIS Hub data portal. So you can go to the primary website, the gis.nd.gov, and there's that great big ginormous icon called Hub Data Portal. You go to that, and you get that middle looking graphic we see on the slide here. And then there's two things. You can either do a search, like type parcels, and you get a drop down like what we see there, and away you go. You can also browse, and well, you know, so there's those categories down below. You can click on land records and run around that way. So if we go to the next slide, some of this might start making more sense. Yep. So you do the search or the browse, and you click on this. If you look at the top of that left graphic, there's the ND GIS Hub parcels. So that's kind of what it should look like. You'll see all sorts of stuff on here. It's pretty standard. It's what we have on the hub. But the thing I want to point out here is the data download. So there's a number of choices that I just want to make people aware of. And don't be surprised if you log in say March of next year. The software that we're using is constantly changing. And so the visuals, the appearance, some of that could differ, but the normal bits and pieces of functionality should remain unchanged. But what I want to point out is that when you download the data, you can click that little download icon that I'm pointing to there. Looks like a little down arrow out of the cloud. And you can pick, you know, CSV, shapefile, file geodatabase, all kinds of fun stuff. But I did want to point out that at the very, very bottom, if you like, I don't want to mess with any of this, you can just download the file geodatabase. It's just a file format. It'll be a statewide data set. So, but if you do want to use one of those other download formats, then if you want, totally up to you. You can use some filter tools like, you know, only download inside of this map extent or filter by a field, all kinds of fun stuff like that. So anyway, but yeah, so have a look at that. Next slide, please. All right. So that was data download, pulling the data down to your system. You know, there's all kinds of reasons to do that. But now if you remember that usage graph, people are using a lot of the web services. This is what we're talking about when we talk about streaming the data, the web service. I think of it as electricity, right? It's just hanging around until you plug it into this outlet and away you go. That's what a service is, really. It's just sitting there. So when you go back and you search and you find the parcel data set, that page will come up that we had seen. And there's a couple of ways of getting to this scary term, REST URL. But you can, maybe if you haven't heard that term REST before, you will have learned something that it stands for that I have to look at the slide myself. You can see it's defined. But it's a protocol, it's a way of communicating. So the purpose, the reason I'm showing you this is if you happen to be a developer or if you're using like something like ArcGIS Desktop, these URLs are very handy. And so you can drop it in to your, say, ArcGIS map or ArcMap, and away you go. So two ways of getting there: view data source, you get that little window, that up arrow pointing to it, you can grab that URL that shows up there and plunk it down. You can also click and open in ArcGIS Online, and then you can find a little box that looks like in that lower right, and you can hit the copy icon or hit view to see the URL. So this, again, some people are using this, maybe not so much. But let me show you another way. So if you go to the next slide there, Michelle. Yeah, so I'm sure a lot of you, if you're not already using the Esri desktop tool called ArcGIS Pro, you might be soon, but it's very, very easy if you are using that tool to consume the parcel data. So you basically, when you're inside of ArcPro, you basically can treat that data, even though it's coming in as a web service, you can treat it as just like a local file database or shape file. You can change the color, put labels on, and so forth. But I'm just showing here on this slide, you can either search by name, like ND GIS Hub PAR, and boom, there's some parcels and other stuff. And there's a layer you can say add to map. Or you can also search inside of groups. And if you type, as it shows in the upper right, you can find a group called land records, and then navigate inside of that and then drag it in. So it's really easy to find. If you ever have any questions on using ArcPro to navigate, just let me know. There's some really nice stuff in there. So anyway, next slide, Michelle. Okay, I almost forgot about this. We've talked about the parcel viewer a few times, but the parcel viewer is a way just to do as it's described, to view the data, to navigate data. We've had it from day zero. A different platform, but very critically important what we used to use and what we still use. In the early days, it was for the QA process and to help people see their data, for us to see the data. And now it's a way to navigate and view data. A lot of people use this tool. I know for a fact that if there's an interruption of service, I hear about it. So it's not only a viewing tool, but we don't have time to go through it. But there is ability like, whoa, that's not right. You know, it should be a different something or another, a different shape, different value. There's a markup tool on the icon bank up there. And you can use that to say this parcel is wrong or this tax roll is wrong, and then hit submit. And then we'll have a nice little picture of what you're looking at. So it's a great way to provide feedback if you think there's an issue. And then I think Michelle mentioned it, we then start to determine what's happening. You know, is it something on our side? Is there something in the data? We have to work with the county, and then we report what we're seeing. So I think it's it's that icon, the third one from the left, is how you get to that markup tool. But anyways, want to point that out. And to get to this viewer, you can there's a link right from the Parcel program site, or even from the gis.nd.gov website, there's a link. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we're making good progress. I think we're about on time. So, Michelle, take it away.
Thank you. Yep, we're doing good. So we've introduced a lot of information, and we're doing a lot of stuff, and it all impacts and involves many of you. So we want your feedback. We do want to improve, and we want this program to succeed. And for that to happen, we need support from all of you. And you being the counties, the vendors, the end users of the data, everybody. The best way to get your support is to listen and act on your feedback if it's in our power to do so. So if you do have feedback, please share it with us. If it's feedback on the program, such as a testimonial to why you're happy about this data set's availability, or to provide info to us about a use case or the savings that having the data has helped you realize, then please use the feedback survey button on the program website. That's this yellow button there. For other types of program feedback or requests for information, you could either use the Contact Us form on the bottom of the page, or you can email Bob at this email address, at Bob's email address. But if you have feedback on the data specifically, such as a potential data issue or an idea for improvement of the data, then you could, again, either use the Contact Us form, or you can submit a data issue through the Parcel viewer. So there are instructions on how to do that, how to submit a data issue through the Parcel viewer, and those instructions are on the program's website. So if we do receive feedback on a data issue, we'll then add it internally into our task tracker system so that we make sure that we follow up on it. And then we'll determine if that issue is due to the source data. So if it's from the provider, if the issue's in the data provided, or if it's an issue that we caused by our ETL process. So once we determine that, if it is an ETL process issue, then we'll find the resolution and we'll make the fix. We'll rerun our process and we'll get the fixed data into the database, and then it'll be published on its schedule. But if the issue is due to the source data, then we'll contact the county and to report the issue and request that they fix it at their earliest convenience and submit an updated version of the data to the program. So either way, if you have issues or feedback, good or bad, please send it along to us in any of these methods. And here's your first opportunity. Do you have any feedback for us right now? Please, if you do, you could put it in the chat, or you can contact us later, of course.
Yeah, Michelle, I think we've answered, and by all means, if anyone wants to chat, please do so now. But I think we've answered everyone's chat comments. If someone disagrees, please let us know, or if we missed you, which we apologize. Up until John asks a very interesting and good question. If I'm looking at it very briefly or just scanning it, we've got we have the issue or challenge of landowner versus operator on the land, and so there's could be 1, 2, maybe more columns of owner information. I think that's kind of what you're mentioning there, John. I'd have to look back. I know we have a spot. Again, I'd have to check, but Michelle, maybe you know off the top of your head, but I think we have in our schema a location for multiple owners, like owner 1 might be the actual landowner living in Vegas versus the operator who lives there. I think we've got a spot for that, and I'd have to check to see how well that's populated. Did I understand that right, John? If you can give me a thumbs up, thumbs down, or something like that, if I understood your question well enough. Or you can, reach out later on that too. But I think right now we'd have to inventory. John, it would help if you could, at your convenience, let me know which county you saw this example in. That's one thing that really helps us out when there's questions like this. Again, an excellent question, or if there's a problem noted. That's why we have the parcel viewer with the map note tool to help us understand where we're looking at, because we are aggregating data from 53 data sources. That's very helpful to know where we're looking so we can make sure our processes are correct, or whether or not that information's in the data. So again, I apologize if I misunderstood your question there, John, but please confirm at some point if I've got it somewhat close.
I think there's a second part to his question is about merging the tax owner information with the shapefile when he receives shapefile from a county. He's asking, why isn't the information already included with the shapefile? And
sorry, good point. I think I can take that.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. I could be wrong here because I'm wrong about a lot of stuff, it seems, but typically the shapefile doesn't respect relationships in terms of like the data. So like if a person downloads a file geodatabase, when it comes down, it will be like if you click on that download file geodatabase link that we saw a few slides ago, everything comes down in the file geodatabase. And the file geodatabase respects the relationships, the one-to-one or one-to-many that are set up. If I remember correctly, when I was looking, when you download a shapefile, that's all you get is of the parcel data. You'd have to download, as you've done, it looks like, to download the tax roll data and then do your own join. I believe that's what's happening. Michelle, you can correct me on that. And
So it could be, I think we'd have to explore it more with John, but it could be the scenario where he's requesting data directly from a county, getting it separate, or if he's getting it from the state program, he could be getting it separate too. And the reason is because, often the data is managed separately. Tax data is managed in a tax system and GIS data is managed in a GIS system. And that's why we do those mismatch reports. And when we join them up is to make sure that they're, that the data is as complete as possible in both systems so that they relate to each other well. But in a GIS system, there in either case, there could be a one-to-many relationship, there could be a many-to-many relationship, there could be a many-to-one relationship, and shapefiles do not model that. Like Bob was saying, you can model that in a geodatabase with a relationship class. Now I'm getting really techie, so I'll back off. But but the point is that tax roll information, the authoritative source for that is the tax department and the tax roll information, not a GIS shapefile. So it is my strong belief and opinion that tax roll information should not be managed and maintained inside of a shapefile. It can be joined easily and merged for uses as it needs to be, because it's always changing too. So you have to, if you put it in a shapefile, you'd have to constantly be editing it in a shapefile, and you don't want to do that. You just join it up.
yeah, it's a good question too, because shapefiles will never die. It's an older format. Maybe who knows, so many years from now it'll be gone. But if there is anyone else using shapefiles, and if the software, and I understand software doesn't always move with the Esri format, but if you do have the option of, if it's Esri software especially, of going towards a file geodatabase, I would really encourage that approach, because that's the future. That's where it's kind of the now as well. It gives you a lot more functionality. Again, I understand not all software has that ability, or there's dependencies on shapefile. So yeah, so John writes that if he gets a shapefile directly from the vendor, includes all the columns from the tax list. Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think that dovetails into what Michelle was talking about, because the data set, as we receive it, is typically two separate data sets, and then we glue it up with the relationship so that we can accomplish the one-to-many. And we have some counties that do this, if they do that merging already, then we can consume it that way. And that's probably what's happening for you, John, where someone's gone to the effort to take the geometry with the attributes and connect it so that when you get the shapefile, it's all right there. It's really sweet. But we discovered early on that approach, as nice as that would be, isn't going to always work, because we have multiple records in the tax roll belonging to one parcel in some cases. So yeah, thanks for that clarification, John. I appreciate it. We're on time. I know, Michelle, you got to bail out. I just want to reiterate, if there's any questions, if we didn't answer your question or we left you hanging, please reach out. Much appreciated. We've got our contact information up there from both Michelle and myself. And then also there's a generic one that we referred to. I just want to thank all you counties, all you vendors for contributing, being part of this project. I know also it takes a lot of work sometimes. It's just a pain when you get the email from me, but thank you. Also, Michelle and I just want to wish you all a very Merry Christmas and enjoyable New Year. So I see you. One last question from Stacy, just I think a clarification. Thank you, Stacy. Yeah, it's very helpful. Thank you for that. Michelle, anything else?
I think eventually when counties move to CAMA systems, that functionality to have multiple owner names in the system will be more available. And that's what I see in many other parts of the country. And often we join up with CAMA data, not tax roll data, probably for that reason. I think
That's
there are
a
other
good point. We do have on Michelle and I's wish list, and there's a possibility that for the upcoming budget cycle, if our budget survives the legislative session, that's one thing we want to explore. We've tagged some time in our thinking that to explore what CAMA integration would look like. There's a lot of use cases in there. So just giving you that heads up. If anyone's interested to provide information on that, just let us know. But okay, Michelle, I know you got to go.
Yeah, I gotta go. Thank you, everybody. Happy holidays.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rory. I saw your last message there. So, yeah.
Bye.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good one. See ya.